So this is our third lesson with Old Testament 1, and we're moving at a rapid pace. And tonight we're going to continue that trend. First night we had the book of Genesis, then we had Exodus and Leviticus with the second night, and now we're moving on with Numbers and Deuteronomy. If I had to pick just a word or phrase to describe these two books together, it would probably be disobedience, because it is there's a lot of disobedience going on in these books, and it actually reminds me a lot of Judges, because I call Judges crime and punishment. but anyway, and then right in between we've got Joshua, which is what happens when people obey. So you've got a lot of disobedience happening in these books, and then you've got the nice intermission of Joshua where people actually listen, and then by chapter 2 of Judges, I think it's chapter 2 verse 10. By chapter 2 verse 10, everybody's forgotten God, and it's going to go downhill from there. Okay, so anyway, so it's a pretty radical thing. When we talk about the book of Numbers, the Hebrew name for this book is the word that means in the wilderness, which doesn't really capture it for West Virginia folks, because to us in the wilderness means this nice place where there's trees with green leaves and a little stream, a kind of a more pleasant environment. In Hebrew thinking, the word wilderness means desert. Okay, so basically what it means is in the desert, in the wilderness of Sinai. That's in the Hebrew version. In the Greek version, which is where our word for it comes from, is the word for numbers. It's because of the census that takes place here. And it's probably, if you read that and aren't careful, you can easily get bogged down in the number thing and never make it to the good stuff. There's actually a lot of good narrative that goes on in this book. Some of the most interesting stories, I think, about Moses are found in the book of Numbers, and well worth your time. So anyway, the book seems to have a little bit of a disorganized structure. It tells us right off the bat, numbering from the start of Exodus, from when they left, that this is the first day of the second month of the second year. Another way of saying that is this is 13 months after the Exodus began. Okay, so 13 months after the Exodus began, the story picks up at the start of this book. The first 10 chapters of this book finds them still at Mount Sinai. Okay, and it begins with a census, and it's a census of 20-year-old males that are able to fight. Think of it as selective service. Okay, and you've got the idea. That's really the idea. And for them, that was being 20 or older. It's kind of confusing to us, because we always hear about the 12 tribes of Israel, and when you start counting them, you're going to run out of fingers pretty quickly there, because there's actually 13 listed. So let's talk about that for a second. Maybe you'll remember, I kind of gave you a little bit of a clue. If you go back in Genesis to the end of Genesis, and you find that narrative where Jacob, now called Israel, is giving the blessing to his sons, you find a strange little story about Joseph and his sons. Now, I don't recall if we even talked. Did we talk about that in the class time? Because basically what Joseph does, what Jacob does, is he comes up with a way to make it so that the person that he always thought should have been his firstborn gets the benefit of being the firstborn. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's a little bit of that family history of his, that, the downright sneakiness of that family, always having a way, really kind of his mom's family, because remember, Laban kind of messes him over too. You remember that, right? Switches girls on him. You guys know this story, surely. Well, that story is still carrying on, clear into modern day, because basically what happens is normally the firstborn gets a double portion of the inheritance. Okay? Well, in order to keep that idea in his head, I really think what Jacob does is he adopts Joseph's sons. Joseph has two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so what happens is they each get a blessing as if they're one of Jacob's sons. That's pretty interesting, don't you think? And that way Joseph gets a double portion. That's pretty slick, isn't it? Because remember, even though Joseph's way down the line in birth order, Joseph is actually number one far as Jacob is concerned, because it's Rachel's firstborn. Okay? Everybody got that? Yeah. Who was the one, the true love of his heart. Okay. So they're actually, so if you count them up, Joseph actually gets two parts, because there's Ephraim and Manasseh. That's why there's no tribe of Joseph. Instead, there's two tribes. There's two, and actually sometimes the scripture will say the half tribe of Ephraim and the half tribe of Manasseh. But when you actually look at the numbers, they're every bit as big as any of the other so-called full tribes. And of course, the one that's not in the main list here, so there are 12 listed, and the one that's not in the main list is Levi, which is the one, of course, that is pulled out separately in their services to God. And remember that they don't actually get like farmland the same way that everybody else does, because their inheritance is the Lord, right? And serving in the temple. Okay. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So more of that family shenanigans going on in that crazy family. Let's see. Here we go. So there, in this census, there are over 600,000 adult fighting men listed. So it's generally estimated there were over 2 million people in the Exodus. You start beginning to think about the practicalities of trying to travel with 2 million people. And you can see why they had to, they were divided in each section. The Levites were supposed to be right around the tent in the middle, okay? But then, around the tabernacle, and then there were 3 tribes on each side. And notice how it talks about they would go according to their standard. In other words, they were very, very organized in the order that they traveled in the same order every day. Because that way, it kept them from getting lost. You know what I mean? Because you can imagine, it wouldn't be hard. Can you imagine going camping with 2 million of your closest relatives? I mean, come on. It's bad enough with 2 dozen, right? So just trying to keep track of everybody was a real nightmare. I have a page reference in my notes. It's page 129 from the old book. You'll have to look and see what it is. But there are a number of passages that talk about the banners and the things like that. You might also find it interesting that on the different sides of the tabernacle. Now, it's funny because I have my notes and my wife's notes together. We actually combined our notes at some point, and I noticed like on hers she says skip skip this part, but I always find it interesting because basically on the different sides, the 4 sides to the four sides of the camp were the 4 points of the compass. Okay, so camp was laid out like a compass points. So on the north was the banner of the eagle, and on the west was the ox, on the south was a picture of a man, and on the east was a lion. And you say, why does that matter at all? Well, it's really interesting if you start reading Ezekiel and Revelation, where it has the living creatures that surround the throne of God. Keep in mind that in the middle of the camp is the tabernacle, which is supposed to be where God hangs out. You see what I mean? So that's kind of interesting, don't you think? So anyway, the Levites are not counted in the original census. They're counted later on in chapters 3 and 4. And it's interesting that for them, it's not the fighting men that's counted, it's any male that's a month old or older. So that's kind of interesting too. Anyway, there's different things that go on. They have to think about sanitation, stuff that doesn't seem like a big deal. It is a big deal. Like people that were sick were put outside the camp. Chapter 5, verse 2, command the children of Israel that they put out of the camp every leper, everyone who has a discharge, whoever becomes defiled by a corpse. In other words, even though they didn't, God knew that he couldn't explain to them what germs were. So instead he just, they gave a list of things. If you have this, if you do that, whatever, then you're out. Okay? You're out there. You're in isolation. Okay? And that was simply, it wasn't punitive. It was actually sanitary. Does that make sense? Before God invented sanitation, okay, just so you know. Lots of interesting things in the law codes, I think. For instance, the idea of making restitution, chapter 5, verse 7, it says you make restitution. If I stole something from you, I'm supposed to make restitution to you. If you're dead, I have to make restitution to your family. If you have no family, then I have to make restitution to God. Okay? But basically, that's how it works. There's also things that to us seem really weird. Like in this same chapter, in verse 11, there's the what I call the law of jealousy. And basically, if a man believes that his wife has been unfaithful, there's a system that is set up where she is basically, they take dust from the floor of the tabernacle, put it in some holy water, mix it up, and have her drink it. Now you and I know that dust and water are not going to normally hurt anyone, right? But here's the deal. The husband has to bring a grain offering. It costs him to do this. This would have been a terrifying prospect. Can you imagine this? That, your husband has accused you of being unfaithful, and therefore he has brought you to the priest. The priest has you drink what I just said. And basically what the law says is if you're innocent, then nothing will happen. And at that point, you have been vindicated. It's actually a way to protect the ladies from unfair accusation. So it seems weird to us, it seems maybe unfair to us. It's completely fair because what it says is, if you have been unfaithful, then you'll get sick. Okay? So basically, if you have been unfaithful, then God will punish you. You'll get sick. Okay? There's the whole thing about the Nazirite vow. We're not going to get into that a whole lot. The whole idea of the Nazirite vow is if you want to separate yourself to God for a special time or a special reason. A couple people you've heard of that have taken this kind of vow are Samson and Samuel. Samuel. Samuel is how you say it. It's actually Shemuel in Hebrew. But anyway, Samson and Samuel were both people who took those vows. It is mentioned in the New Testament. Let's see. The priestly blessing is found at the end of chapter 6. And it goes like this. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. And the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So if you're looking for a prayer of blessing, there's one right there. Okay. Let's see. Some offerings mentioned in 7 and 8. Chapter 9 is the celebration of the Passover. Again, keeping in mind that they never do the blood on the doorposts again. That's only in the very first time. If you've got somebody that's a guest in your house, they have to celebrate it with you. Let's see. And we're just kind of moving along through here. So chapters 10 through 20 is, a lot of making of mistakes and things like that, although actually some interesting stories in here. We'll probably focus on a couple of those. The idea of the trumpets, I think, is an interesting thing because the trumpets actually are important later on in the New Testament. The idea of the trumpet is mentioned a couple times. The trumpet was the signal to leave, time to leave. I mean, they probably had different, probably a different thing was blown depending on what they were doing. It was also the sign for battle, and it was also the sign for celebration. In the New Testament, it is also the sign of, in Revelation, it is the sign of different things happening in the order of events. So different things occurring. There's the 7 trumpets. You'll recall that in both Matthew and 1 Thessalonians talks about that the rapture happens at the last trumpet. If you remember that. So, but chapter 10, verse 11 is when they leave Sinai. And off they go. And it doesn't take very long. Chapter 11, verse 1, and they're already complaining. Okay? And, the complaints are various, but, people, it's not a good thing. Maybe it would be a good thing for all of us to know what it says. It says, verse 1, now when the people complained, it displeased the Lord. For the Lord heard it. Why is it that we don't realize that God hears it when we complain? For the Lord heard it, and his anger was aroused. And there are several times throughout this story, actually stories, one right after another, where the only reason that Israel survives is because of Moses. God's like, okay, that does it. I've had it. I'm going to blast them back up. Back up. I don't want you to get singed. And then, Aaron and Moses fall on their face, call out to God, ask for God's intervention. You get the idea. So, anyway. Let's see. Yeah, let's see. There's fire at the edge of the camp. I think we could see, it's not hard to see where God gets frustrated. I mean, they complain because all we've got to eat is this manna. You think about it. All we've got to eat is this food that magically appears every night, and all we have to do is walk outside the tent and pick it up. Does this sound a little ungrateful, maybe? Probably, yeah. So, needless to say, God's not too happy. And of course, at one point they said they want meat, and so God, having a sense of humor, makes it to where they just eat meat for a while, okay? And at one point Moses doubts here, because Moses is thinking, I've got a couple million people here, how am I going to feed all these people meat? Okay, let's think about that. God's response is the arm of the Lord too short? Okay, is God not able to handle this? You don't think God can handle this? I mean, come on, Moses, you've been hanging out with me now for a while. I would think you figured this out, right? Of course, God has the quail come in and land right there. Like I said, God does have a sense of humor because he's like, well, if they want meat so much, they can just eat meat for a while. So, I don't know, I kind of think that's amusing, don't you? Yeah. So anyway, one of my favorite passages is in this book is Numbers 12, which is where they complain against Moses. And there's some interesting subtleties going on in the story. We're not sure exactly what prompts them to complain. It seems like there might be a little bit of prejudice going on. Prejudice, can you believe that? Right? Prejudice? Really? In the Bible? I mean, people were prejudiced? We've cured all that, right? Unfortunately not, huh? I mean, that's the thing. That's one of the reasons that it rings so true. So look in chapter 12, verse 1. Miriam and Aaron. Okay, so Miriam is Now keep in mind who this is. Miriam is the very first lady ever called a prophetess in the Bible. Aaron is the very first high priest. I mean, you're talking this is a holy dude and a holy dudette, right? They're supposed to be. And of course it's the sister and brother of Moses, but they spoke against Moses. And here it does tell us it's because of the Ethiopian woman that he had married. Now we don't know if she'd be an Ethiopian, if she was a black woman, which seems likely, but there was something about her that they didn't like. Probably that she was Ethiopian, so they didn't like her. For he had married an Ethiopian woman, so they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? You know how it is. Sometimes it's easy to get jealous, isn't it? And so it sounds like a little bit of jealousy there too. A little bit of prejudice, a little bit of jealousy. I mean, hasn't God spoken through us too? And indeed God had. There's only one problem. God was listening. In fact, I get the impression God's always listening, don't you? Uh-huh. And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very humble, more than, this is an interesting comment, don't you think? More than all men who were on the face of the earth. He was the most humble guy on the earth. That's really saying something, don't you think? Mm-hmm. And so suddenly God is just totally ticked. It's just a bad sign when you're there and all of a sudden, suddenly the Lord said to Moses, Aaron and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tabernacle of meeting. So the three came out, and don't you think they're wondering what's up? Then the Lord came down in the pillar of cloud and stood in the door of the tabernacle and called Aaron and Miriam, and they went forward, and he said, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, even plainly, and not in dark sayings, and he sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? You ever had like one of them chills go down your spine? I'm thinking this is a good moment for that, don't you? Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? That's a good question. Don't you think? Who thinks that's a good question? Very good question. So the anger of the Lord was aroused against him, and he departed. And when the cloud departed from above the tabernacle, suddenly Miriam became leprous, as white as snow. Then Aaron turned toward Miriam, and there she was, a leper. And of course, keep in mind that was this horrible thing to contract in those days. I mean, there was no cure other than divine intervention. Okay? And it was a sentence to be forever alone. The only other people you were allowed to be around was lepers, and you had to be outside the camp. This is a problem, right? So Aaron says to Moses, "Oh, my Lord, please do not lay this sin on us in which we have done foolishly and in which we have sinned. Please do not let her be as one dead, whose flesh is half consumed when he comes out of his mother's womb." This is just an interesting thing. So Aaron and Miriam are talking, and apparently Miriam was the one doing the talking. Okay, that's what I get out of this, don't you? Yeah, so she must have been the one talking. So Aaron begs Moses to do something about it. Then Moses begs God, and God does relent, but it's interesting that God doesn't relent immediately. "Please heal her, O God, I pray." Then the Lord said to Moses, "If her father had but spit in her face, would she not be shamed 7 days? Let her be shut out of the camp 7 days, and afterward she may be received again." This is called time out. Okay? She got time out, and basically the whole shebang was called to a screeching halt while they waited the 7 days for her to get better. Okay? So, I don't know. I kind of think in a way, it's terrible. It's awful. This is awful. This is terrible. But it's also terribly amusing. Don't you? You know what I'm saying? I mean, there's a little bit of that poetic justice thing going on, right? And you have to admit, God does have a little bit of a sense of humor. So anyway, it doesn't take very long for people to get in trouble again. By chapter 13, they're sent in to spy out the land. Okay, the land is beautiful, it's wonderful, and it's scary. Okay, it's wonderfully scary because it's filled with giants, and the land devours those that its inhabitants. And anyway, it just goes poorly because people don't believe. When they come back, verse 27 of chapter 13, this is what they say to Moses, the spies. Then they told him and said, "We went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit." And remember, they brought all that stuff back. "Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan." There's every kind of ite you've ever thought of living there, right? And they're big. The sons of Anak, that's the giants. They're great big, hairy, ugly dudes. They got walled cities, and all we've got is a slingshot, right? Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let's go get them," right? That's basically what he says. Let's go get them. "Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it." You just got to love Caleb. By the way, Caleb's name means dog. Did you know that? A man named Dog. That's it. I preached a sermon that one time. The story of a man named Dog. Caleb and Joshua both think they can do it. Okay? So basically they have a vote. Moses says let's do it. Aaron says let's do it. Joshua says let's do it. Caleb says let's do it. Everybody else says, well, we can't do it. So even though God says to go do it, only 4 people listen to what God says. Well, you know the rest of the story, don't you? Basically, they've doomed themselves. That's what I call it, is the doom of Israel, 14:12. So the people wept and they cried, and they, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. This is verse 2. Why has the Lord brought us? And, keep in mind, God's listening, right? Let's get somebody else as the leader. It's time to pick a new leader. We got this stupid Moses guy. Now, it was just the last chapter, wasn't it, that somebody got in big trouble for saying stuff like that, right? But Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied on the land, tore their clothes, which is a sign of mourning, by the way, and they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, "The land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into the land and give it to us. A land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." Well, the people were ready to kill them, and then God shows up. And basically the Lord says to Moses, "How long will these people reject me? How long will they not believe me? All the signs that I perform among them, I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they." I'm just going to blast them. I've had it. I've had all I can stand, and I can't stand no more, right? I mean, these are tough people to travel with. I don't know if you've got that or not, okay? They are tough traveling companions. So anyway, it doesn't go real well. But basically what, of course you guys know, the punishment is that none of this generation, of all those people that have been counted, none of them will enter the land. Okay? Now, I want you to do a couple of things in your head here, math-wise. None of that, that's 20 and older. Okay? Everybody 20 and older. Not going to enter the land. Okay? Not one. It's actually two of them, though. Caleb and Joshua. But not one of all the rest of them are going to make it. Ooh, this doesn't sound good at all, does it? And you're going to wait 40 years. So if you're going to wait 40 years, that means that every person that's 20 and older just got a death sentence. None of you will live older than 60. Did you just catch that? Mm-hmm. Okay. So then, being the great rocket scientists they are, the next morning they get up and say, well, maybe we should just do it. So day one, God says do it, and they say no. And they cry all night long. God says you're going to have to wander in the wilderness and you're going to die, all of you, by the time you're 60. You know what I mean? This is not a happy story. So then they think about that, and so the next day, and God says, go ahead, you better get out of here and just take off. Well, they disobey that, and they decide they're going to go ahead and try to do it now. Except now they're trying to do it without God. How do you think that goes? Nah, man, this is getting worse and worse, right? So needless to say, that doesn't work either. And then, now keep in mind, we've already seen what, everybody in the camp knew this thing about Miriam. Everybody has already seen what happens when, you diss God's servant, okay? Well, it just doesn't go well, okay? So it doesn't take very long. Chapter 16, they decide they're ticked because these people got killed. They're ticked because people got killed. People got killed because they disobeyed God. Then they disobeyed God again, people got killed. This is a big surprise, right? Mm-hmm. So then, they decide that they're going to have a big rebellion against Moses and Aaron. Who thinks this is going to work out bad? It is not going to go well, right? It is not going to go well. By the way, one of the things I think you should follow up on and make a note of this that you can look it up later is you should follow the life of this guy named Caleb, because God is going to remember him. And Joshua chapter 14, verse 11 and 15 is going to tell you what happens when he goes into the land, because he asks to be assigned the area with the giants. Isn't that interesting? I'm not afraid of a giant. So he beats the giants, by the way. They should have put him in front. Anyway, you got to like that guy. So they're sentenced by their own words. So this is Korah's rebellion, in case you've never heard of that. They rise up against Moses and Aaron, and they accuse Moses. Now keep in mind, what's Moses been called by God? The most humble person on the face of the earth. That is quite a saying. So here are what? 4 chapters later, rocket scientist named Korah says, you exalt yourselves. Who thinks this is a false accusation? I'm afraid it's a false accusation, isn't it? Okay? So we've actually been told a couple times Moses is humble. And basically what Moses tells, so they there's this elaborate thing. Some of the rest of them think that they ought to be able to offer up incense and not just dare and be able to do that. In case you don't know what this is, when it talks about a censer, okay, a censer is like a little metal pot. So you take your little metal pot, put your little coal in your metal pot, put you some incense in your metal pot, then smoke comes out of the metal pot. It's usually on a chain, okay, because the metal pot is hot. Okay, then you swing the metal pot, and if you've ever been in like a Catholic church or something, when they come in, they swing when the priest comes in and they carry in, usually they carry in the Bible, they swing back and forth, right? It's definitely worth seeing. So anyway, these guys, they all supposed to bring the little pot. They're all supposed to get swing, they're burning their incense and everything. It doesn't work out real well. Okay, all the dudes with the metal pots, the fire comes out of the altar and consumes them, and all that's left is the pot. Okay, so all the metal pots fall to the ground. Okay, and they're all gone. Whoosh. All the other people, like Korah and all the other people that have bad-mouthed Moses, the ground opens up and swallows them whole. And then seals back. And it says they go down to the pit. That's the word Sheol. It's not a good thing, right? I'm thinking this is bad, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that, all of them, everybody, tent, everything, down in the hole there. So. Man, don't mess with Moses, okay? Mm-hmm. Anybody got that? Because he's the servant of the Lord, right? Remember what God said. Why was it you weren't afraid? Isn't that what God said? Why was it you weren't afraid to badmouth my servant Moses? Because everybody else, if I want to talk to him, I send him a dream. But Moses, I come and hang out with him face to face. What can I say? Moses is considered by the Hebrew people to be the greatest prophet of the Old Testament. I don't know if you know that or not. He's the greatest of the prophets. Greatest of prophets. We don't even usually call him a prophet, but he is considered to be the greatest prophet. Can you see why? Okay. And if you don't remember the end of the story, if you turn to the end of the book of Deuteronomy, which of course, Moses doesn't make it into the promised land. Although to be quite honest with you, don't think that that's a really bad thing necessarily, because Moses has put up with these people forever, okay? And I'm thinking that he's about to do a vacation, and hanging out with God for the rest of eternity doesn't really seem all that bad to me. Does it to you guys? No. This is what it says in Deuteronomy 34:10. It says, "But since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, in all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, in all his land, and by all that mighty power, and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel." Since then, there's never been a prophet like Moses. That's what it's saying, okay? So, that's quite the thing to say, right? Oh, yeah. And in fact, if you back up a couple verses, it says that God himself buried Moses, right? I think the reason God buried Moses was so that people didn't go and worship Moses, because nobody knows where he's buried. If they did, there'd be people there worshiping him or trying to dig him up. They'd have dug him up and put him in the museum in D.C., right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. He'd probably be in the British Museum more likely, but you get the idea. There with a bunch of pharaohs and stuff. But no, God didn't let that happen. Apparently, even the devil wanted the body of Moses, because it says in the New Testament, are you familiar with that? In Jude, it mentions that the archangel Michael disputed with the devil over his body. Do you remember that? Anyway, it says here that God buried him. I'm thinking when God shows up, that's the end of the argument. What do you guys think? Yeah. Pretty much, right? Yeah. Then God showed up. Okay, next story. Yep, that's the end of that book. So anyway, you go back in there. So Korah's rebellion, although ironically enough, the little metal pots, the censers, were considered to be holy. They'd been purified by the fire of God from the altar, and so they actually they collected them. The priests were told to collect them. And anyway, some weird stuff happens sometimes, doesn't it? And strangely enough, this is actually Let me get back to where that is. I'm in the wrong book. Get back into Numbers again. So that was in chapter 16. And this is still in chapter 16. The very next day, they come and complain to Moses, and they blame Moses for all them people dying. Okay? God's response to that is stand back. Okay? Once again, I'm thinking it's about ready to get really, really ugly. What do you guys think? Do you see what I mean? How this book is all about disobedience? It's just again and again and again. And it's just like, these are the dumbest people on the face of the earth. And what's really scary is that we're probably more like them than we are like Moses. So anyway, I've always found this to be a fascinating story. Moses and Aaron fall on their faces. Verse 46, Moses says to Aaron, take a censer, and you guys already know what that is, and put fire in it from the altar, put incense on it, and take it quickly to the congregation and make atonement for them. For wrath has gone out from the Lord, the plague has begun. This is actually a very powerful passage too. It makes a great, I think, sermon. There's wonderful preaching in this book. You think about this. So basically, Aaron acts as a priest does. By the way, in case you don't know, the incense symbolizes the prayers of the saints. And you actually see that in the book of Revelation, the incense from the altar is the prayers of the saints on earth. Okay, so the incense in heaven is actually a good aroma before the Lord, which is the prayers of his saints. Okay, so that's what all this earthly stuff symbolizes, is stuff in heaven. Does that make sense? Okay, so Aaron runs to the altar and quickly gets coal, quickly gets incense. This is not something that's easy to do quickly, okay? Because you're going to get burned, right? And then he runs, and then just picture this, the plague is sweeping across the people. And Aaron runs and puts himself between the healthy people and the plague stops when it gets to him. Now, who thinks this is scary stuff? I'm thinking that's pretty scary, don't you? Okay, preachers, I need you to grab your Bible and run and stand between the sinners and their fate, okay? Because that's basically what he's told to do, isn't it? Man, you run over there. It'd been awful easy, wouldn't it, to just say the plague had begun. 14,700 people died before he could get over there. Does that tell you something? I mean, it was sweeping through the people. Wow. But you think about that. Doesn't the Lord stand between us and judgment? Because he is our great high priest. You see what I'm saying? There's good stuff there. And there, what blows my mind is there are people who don't preach the Old Testament. How can you not preach the Old Testament? I mean, Jesus preached the Old Testament all the time, didn't he? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know it. So I don't understand that. I mean, it's like, wow. Okay. So chapter 18 and 19 is details about the priest. Of course, we just saw the priest in action. Chapter 20 is where we see why Moses doesn't get into the promised land. And like I said, everybody, we look at this and we think, oh, this is terrible, Moses didn't make it. Yeah, instead he died and went to paradise. And when he dies, the scripture says that his strength was not dim. Do you understand? It didn't matter how old he was, that his body didn't act like it was a day older. You see that? So, if you live to be 120 and then God takes you immediately to heaven, who thinks this is a terrible fate? Maybe not, right? I'm thinking that it wasn't all that bad of a thing. But if you want to see what the failure is, the failure that Moses has is actually a failure of faith. It's in the 20th chapter. And isn't that really our primary failures? So the people are, strangely enough, complaining. I know you're surprised, right? They're complaining. They're out in the desert. It's hot. They want water. So the Lord, in verse 7 of chapter 20, speaks to Moses, saying, take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together, speak to the rock before their eyes. This is very important. In my Bible, I've circled the word speak. They've done this deal before, by the way, but the way they did it before was they whacked the rock. Okay? But listen to what God says to them to do. Speak to the rock. Okay? Before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels. He'd been wanting to say that for a long time. Must we bring water for you out of this rock? Then Moses, to me this sounds like something out of Andy Griffith. But anyway, then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. And water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. Everything's okay, right? It's not okay. Why is it not okay?
Because you're supposed to speak to it.
He was supposed to speak to the rock. So I want you to think about this. And I left my rod at home. But so you've taken your rod and you whack the rock once. And what happens? Nothing. Why? He wasn't supposed to hit the rock. So then he does whack, and he whacks it again, and water starts coming out. Do you know why water came out of the rock? Because God had Moses' back, even though Moses had just failed. Nobody else realizes it. Okay, so everybody else is just there thinking, there's water, yay! Everybody's just happy about the water. Nobody even knows what's happened right there. Listen to the rest. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me, to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. What was their failure? It's a failure of faith, because you didn't believe me. It's not the rod. It's not a magic stick, guys. It's God. The power is from God, not from the stick. Have you got that? And at that point, even though all the stuff they've been through, all the plagues, they've walked through the Red Sea on dry ground. Again and again and again. And here's what I'm going to tell you. Don't think you're immune. Okay? It doesn't make any difference how smart you are, how long you've been serving to the Lord, how many sermons you've preached, how many degrees you end up getting. It doesn't make any difference how many years you've preached and you've baptized 195,000 people. There's still going to be a moment sometimes when you have a little doubt. Isn't that right? If Moses had a doubt, I guarantee that we will. Right? Because you did not believe me. Because you did not believe me. That belief thing is big stuff in the Bible, okay? It is our bread and butter. It is what makes the whole thing work. It is the difference between being a Christian and not. It is the difference between heaven and not. And for Moses, it is the difference between going into promised land and not. Okay? So you might make a note of that. That's what happens. Okay? So anyway. And keep in mind that it's also sort of the end of Moses' humility. He's been doing really great up to this point. must we bring water out of this rock, you rebels? I mean, that doesn't actually sound very humble, does it?